Welcome to CLAFI Office Hour podcast. Today we're honored to have Professor Helmut Anheier with us. Professor Anheier has held professorships and leadership positions at multiple prestigious institutions. His work extends beyond teaching. He was the founding director of the Center for Civil Society at both UCLA and the London School of Economics. And he served as the president of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, Germany, for over a decade. Additionally, he is a prolific editor, contributing to numerous journals and book series. His research spans governance, culture, indicator systems, nonprofits, and philanthropy, significantly contributing to the field through over 500 publications. Again, we're extremely honored to have him here today, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Professor Anheier, with such a distinguished career in both academic and leadership roles, can you share with us what initially drew you to the field of civil society and governance, and how your interests have evolved over the years?
Yes, thank you. And also thank you for your kind words of introduction. I was not drawn initially to the fields of civil society and governance. I began my academic career with an emphasis on comparative sociology, social network analysis, and organizational studies. And when I finished my dissertation, I assumed people would be interested in the more formal parts of my work, network analysis, but they were primarily interested in the substance of it, which was a comparative study of non-governmental organizations in Africa. So I was drawn into the field of NGOs and non-profit organizations, and civil society did not become a topic until later, much later, only in the late 1990s, with the events in Central and Eastern Europe, and governance became an interest of mine even later, when I became the president of the Hertie School, and we had to develop a research agenda for the school.
Thank you for sharing your experience in detail. Well, and you mentioned your work regarding nonprofit organization. That brings us to the next question. Your book, Nonprofit Organization, Theory, Management, Policy, is the first comprehensive textbook in the field of nonprofit studies. And an integral characteristic of the book is its comparative and international perspective, which you have mentioned. What inspired you to emphasize this comparative approach? And how do you think it enhances your readers' understanding of nonprofit management and policy, especially in an increasingly globalized context?
Well, the book is in many ways a product of both research and teaching. In terms of research, I was the associate director of the Johns Hopkins Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project that started in the 1990s, and at that time was a fairly elaborate comparative research effort that spanned almost 40 countries. And so we focused on nonprofits, and then we expanded that also to cover civil society. And at the same time, I started teaching. First at Johns Hopkins, we had a course on nonprofit policy and comparative perspective. And when I moved to London, to the London School of Economics, and to the Center of Civil Society, we had a master's program that focused on the management of voluntary organizations, that's a term used in England, and then NGOs. And so it was this teaching experience, the research experience, that then led me to write this book. And it's now in its third edition.
I remember reading you mention thanks to the students that you have taught over the years in your preface of the book. And in another role of yours as the principal investigator of the Berggruen Governance Index project at UCLA, you've recently hosted the 2024 Berggruen Governance Index Conference. Could you first explain what initially drew you to explore governance system indicators and what motivated the development of this comprehensive index?
I think I was drawn to comparative indicators of how well countries are governed. In other words, how well are they at managing public problems? When I started at the Hertie School, and we were looking for a niche, what we as a school, as a team of faculty members could add to our understanding of that question. And then we looked at governance indicators out there, in particular the World Bank governance indicator, and we felt that it is a bit too technocratic and narrow, and we wanted to broaden it by understanding governance not as one outcome, but as a system that involves an interplay between democratic accountability, state capacity, and public goods deliverance. And that's how the Berggruen Governance Index came about.
I remember reading about how it's a triangle dynamic between the three of them. Why did you choose the three of each indicators?
We wanted to express the notion that there is a tension between these three, and they interact. And why these three and not five? Because we could perhaps have added others, but we felt that they are the key ones, and we wanted to have a parsimonious system.
I see. Following on from that, could you share some of the most significant findings or shifts in global governance that the Berggruen Governance Index has revealed over the years?
I think I'll probably focus on the 2024 findings mostly, but in 2022 we saw that Africa is really improving in its governance, and we saw that both as a promise but also as a challenge. And I'll say more about that when we come to 2024. In 2024, we see that many countries are dropping when it comes to democratic accountability. At the same time, they are increasing in terms of public goods provision. And that is a big tension, because we say that normally democracies are better at delivering public goods because the population has a voice. In autocracies, of course, that is not the case, but it seems to be that state capacity is increasingly seen as a key to a better quality of life, and that democracy seems to be of a lesser role. And we wanted to challenge that with a 2024 analysis. And we came to the conclusion that there is indeed a group of countries that has improved quite a lot in terms of quality of life, not at a level of the established democracies, but it is worrying that more countries may say, oh, we don't need a democracy, all we need is to have sufficient state capacity to serve the population.
Do you think you have any advice to leaders in these countries, as in how should they view this productivity, but maybe not sustainability for their development?
It depends on where the countries are, and if we have countries that have relatively higher level of democratic accountability, but they're doing badly in state capacity, and hence the population is not being served well, they really need to improve their state capacity, and do so in steps that tell the population, hey, something is being done, right? Otherwise, you have a backlash very soon. If you are in a country that is low in terms of democracy, low in terms of quality of government, and low in terms of quality of life, it is only small incremental steps that you can see to move forward.
That's very insightful. And according to the news article from the Hertie School, your forthcoming book, Governing Self-Power, examines the intricate relationship between cultural and political dynamics in international relations. Given your expertise and passion for culture policy, which I've had a privilege to learn about in your class, could you share the core things your book will address? Additionally, what inspired you to focus on the topic of self-power in your latest work?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. It emerged from a project I did it's still going on, for the Foreign Office in Berlin, and the Foreign Office wanted to know how Germany's soft power approaches, so what Germany does to generate more soft power, so attraction, right? That other countries think that Germany is an attractive country and they're likely to do business with it. And they wanted to know how does Germany compare to the United Kingdom, to France, United States, so the allies or the partners, as they would say. And then they also say, well, we increasingly feel that there are competitors out there. And they mentioned China, they mentioned Russia, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So we did a comparative analysis and found that there are indeed massive differences in how soft power is used and for what purpose. And that then triggered the book project with Oxford University Press, and that will come out probably next year at some point. But also the continued project that we also looked at in this class, kind of external cultural policy in a comparative perspective.
I think I've read the research article. It's the Germany geopolitics one, right? Soft power and geopolitics. And how do you think this book will expand from the research that you've done for the reports?
It will expand the report, because the report was written really with the German Foreign Office in mind, and the Oxford University Press book will be much broader. So it will look at each of the 8 countries or 9 countries that we will cover on their own term.
Right. And another of your forthcoming book, titled Gender Equality in the Creative Industries, a comparative study, is set to be released soon. Could you share some insights into what prompted you to explore this topic and what key findings or themes you hope will resonate with your readers?
This goes back to the late 2010s, when I was contacted by the Chancellor, Angela Merkel's office, and Angela Merkel and her staff always had an interest in gender issues, and a report came out that showed that the gender issues in the field of arts and culture have not really developed or moved very much over a nearly 15-year period when the previous report was published. And they asked me to conduct a comparative analysis of how the stagnant situation in Germany compares to other countries. So we looked at the EU countries mostly, and we found some really interesting developments around what is called gender mainstreaming. And then the publisher was very interested and said, "Would you like to turn this report into a more academic book?" And that is the book that you just mentioned. And we added the United States, and we found that the United States is the worst performing country when it comes to gender equity and gender equality in arts and culture. And even Italy and Poland are doing much better. Sweden and France are the top performers, right? And Germany somewhere in between. And the main reason why you have these differences is whether a country has gender mainstreaming as a policy that is ingrained in all policy fields, right? And the United States does not really have it. Sweden has had it for 10, 15 years, right? And so you see that in countries like Sweden, women and men are almost at parity. Whereas in the US, we have a big gender gap in terms of salaries, in terms of pensions, access to key institutions, and so on.
Do you think this brings back to the idea of the importance of domestic culture policies?
Absolutely. Yeah. But domestic culture policy must be part of a larger effort, right? So there is gender mainstreaming on top, and then in culture, in education, in health, and in all other fields, you need to have that mainstream.
I see. In addition to your impressive academic career, you served as a social affairs officer at the United Nations and were heavily involved with UNESCO. Could you share some reflections on your experiences with these organizations?
Oh, yes. I've always been committed to the ideals of the United Nations system, and when you enter the UN as a social affairs officer, in this case, you quickly realizes that they are bureaucracies, and for good reasons, right? And I'm not made to be a bureaucrat, and so I quickly, after 2 years, decided that I would like to go back to academia, because I favor autonomy over stability, right? So, and that's by no means a criticism of the UN system, but to play an active role in the UN system, you have to, in a way, earn your keep, right? You have to be in the system for a decade or two till you come into a position of responsibility, and where you can shape the way policies and run programs. And I was too impatient a young man, and I wasn't prepared to wait a decade or two, and so I returned to academia.
But do you think there is some shortcoming in the bureaucratic format in itself? Now, so many years later, do you think you would still make the same choice?
I would still make the same choice. The UN is unfortunately totally undercapitalized, and it lives from one budget crisis to the other, and it cannot become the entrepreneurial and agile organization it should be. So it is still very much in a 1950s mold organizationally. And I've been consultant to various UN organizations, and I think it's better now than it was when I was there. It's more open. I think hiring policies have become more flexible. Have more people from the outside enter the organization, and one thing you need to know when you are consultant, very often you're asked not to come up with really brilliant new ideas, but you asked to give support to what is already on the way. Right?
I see. How have these roles with collaboration with UN influenced your approach to teaching and research in public policy and nonprofit management?
Only in the sense that I can draw on experiences with different UN organizations, right, from UNDP to World Bank, and of course the International Narcotics Control Board, where I worked for 2 years, and UNESCO, where I consulted numerous times. So you get a lot of experience, and you come across important cases that you can then share in your teaching.
I see. In addition to your academic and UN roles, you've also mentioned your involvement with government work in various capacities. Could you share some insights from your experience in the public sector or working with the public sector?
Yeah, I think the biggest insight is that the public sector, at least in the last, let's say, 2 or so decades, very often feels on the defensive, right? And we have so many dedicated people in the public sector that feel underappreciated. And you have to be mindful of that. You can't walk into a ministry and appear that you are the know-it-all, or that you know how to much better. So you have to be sensitive to their concerns. That's an important lesson that I think we all should have.
Yeah, I appreciate your honest answer. And another role you have as the founding editor-in-chief of 3 journals, including Global Perspective with the University of California Press. What have been some of the most challenging and rewarding aspects of launching and managing academic journals?
Let me focus on Global Perspectives, which came out of the Global Studies Encyclopedia that with a colleague at UCSB I published in the early 2010s. So, and the publisher was very excited about it, and the editor we had, and then she moved to UC Press from Sage, and she floated the idea of a journal, and which I found exciting for a number of reasons. First, I've always been a bit frustrated at a siloed structure of academia, right? So you have sociology, you have economics, you have political science, you have law, and it's very little interaction. And the problems that you have, particularly at public policy schools, is you need to bring them together, right? And that's what always drew me to public policy schools, by the way. And so establishing a journal was a big challenge, because the disciplinary journals and the disciplinary culture is so strong that you immediately emerge as the second best option to publish. And that is a challenge. And to come out of that, we had what I think a relatively novel idea. We said that we're not mentioning disciplines at all. We're mentioning fields, right? Like market and exchange systems, culture, and I think values and identities. Right? So we made up 7 or 8 of these overarching thematic fields, and then we got what we thought were some of the leading thinkers in each of them to be on the editorial board. So we have a very, very complex structure, right? So we have 8 separate editorial boards, and we have an editorial board at large. So it's over 120 people, and managing them was a big challenge.
I see. You mentioned your encyclopedia work. I actually personally purchased the Global Studies Encyclopedia.
Goodness.
Yes, it was $500 something. It was my birthday gift from my dad, but I really loved reading it. It was very insightful. And you've actually involved in multiple works for encyclopedias. Why did you find that interesting, or why did you start working for that?
I did several encyclopedias. So one was the field of nonprofit studies and civil society. You see, that was a rapidly evolving field, and the nomenclature, the terminology was not at all settled. And we wanted to bring some conceptual order to it. And as it happened, I had relatively good funding from a foundation that was exactly interested in that. So I could employ a small army of research assistants, actually here at UCLA, who could help with drafting the various bits and pieces. And that's the International Encyclopedia of Civil Society, and it's now being updated, right? And then the Global Studies Encyclopedia, and then the International Social Science Encyclopedia, focusing on methodology.
And as a distinguished scholar and editor-in-chief of a prominent academic journal, could you share some advice for UCLA undergraduate students aspiring to pursue careers in the academia?
I think academia is a very rewarding career, but it's also very risky, because you do not know whether you made it, so to speak, by the time you're in your late 30s, right? And you shouldn't do it for the money, because the money is not that great. But what it does, other than bring you in contact with a lot of smart people and interesting students, it allows you a degree of autonomy that you can really have elsewhere, right? And it allows you to follow your passion, right? So if you like autonomy, and if you're willing to take the risk, and if you like the idea of following your passion, then academia is a good choice.
As we move into the next section of our interview, we have some questions from CLAFI students. The first one is, given your extensive experience in nonprofit and governance studies, what advice would you offer to UCLA students interested in pursuing careers in nonprofits potentially?
My advice would be not to limit yourself to nonprofits. Focus on a field or a set of issues that are important to you. And then you can decide at the appropriate time, and you don't have to decide for the rest of your life whether you want to start working on this in a nonprofit or for-profit or in a government context. And you can also shift back and forth, right? So one nice thing about being a student is that you can keep your options open.
That's very useful advice, actually. A lot of times people focus on one thing and they forget to explore different options we have as young people. And what skills and experience should they focus on during their university time to develop the skills needed for those careers?
That's a good question. I think the curriculum that we have in public affairs does a fairly good job. So you get some of the basics when it comes to methodology, statistics, analytics. Analytics are very important because you can apply them to very, very different fields, right? And then try to get as broad a scope in different policy fields as possible. So even if, let's assume that you're really concerned about the homeless, don't make the mistake of taking every possible course about the homeless, right? Make sure that you have a broader exposure to different policy fields.
That's very good advice as well. You have been in the realm of education for so long, and you have taught many generations of students. Do you notice a change in students' engagement, interest, or learning styles over the years? How have these changes impacted your teaching approach?
Another good question. I mean, these changes are very subtle. They're all not only in one direction, where they go back and forth a bit. I find that the students at UCLA, and these are the undergraduate students, because graduate students are somewhat different. The undergraduate students at UCLA are more interested in international and comparative aspects today than they were 20 years ago when I started teaching at UCLA.
Why would you think that is the case?
I think because we are becoming more of this world, so to speak. The United States is realizing that it's not the only country in the world, and students would like to know more about what goes on in other parts. And the student body has become more diverse as well.
Considering the changes you have mentioned, how do you see emerging technologies, such as AI tools like ChatGPT, shaping the future of learning and teaching in higher education? What opportunities and challenges do they present for both educators and students?
I think we were probably going to make the same mistake we always made, but we overestimate the new technologies coming, and we underestimate the degree to which they will come with unanticipated consequences. So we will probably have a period of great uncertainty around AI, and we will be behind the curve. So technology is going to be ahead. But keep in mind, education is a very slow-moving field, and it's very often, you might say, risk-averse. And innovations are not welcomed very often by those in charge, particularly the professoriate. Right? So professors find it sometimes very hard to change the way they teach, right? Because they're happy with the way things are, and they like to focus on their research. So, but anyway, there will be a period of uncertainty, and I think that uncertainty will also affect the students. And for the first time, I feel among students a certain hesitancy when it comes to new technologies. And I think it's an open question whether your generation will embrace AI the same way as the previous generation embraced the internet.
Is there any advice you give to students regarding their learning styles or approach to learning in general, not only in universities?
Yes, I think when it comes to technologies, or in particular, don't let AI do the work for you, because you're at the university not to learn how to use AI. You're at the university to use your own mind and to become, in a way, creative in approaching a problem. And AI may be the easy way out, but it's not going to do you some good. So I would say, feel comfortable being challenged and finding your own way through a problem without resorting to some easy choices.
Another key aspect of technological advancement is social media. Do you have any opinion on social media and its influence on the new generation of students?
Well, it's kind of mixed. I think the social media, it may make it so easy to connect with so many different people, but it's kind of a mile wide and an inch deep. And I wonder if students still develop these deep friendships with others, and particularly at college, that sometimes last you a lifetime, and whether the ease of social media does not take away from a deeper engagement with a small number of people. But I'm wondering about it. I don't have the answer to that.
That's a very interesting perspective. Usually people would be more worried about the algorithm aspect of things. And I think the friendship of things and the connectedness to people is also very important and disruptive of social media. Yeah. And throughout your career, how did you balance the demand of your professional life with personal interest or downtime? Are there particular hobbies or activities that you find particularly rewarding or relaxing?
First of all, I managed that balance very badly, and partly because I very often don't think about what I do as work, right? Because I just like it, and I'm in a fortunate position that I actually don't need to work. for financial reasons. I just like teaching. I like doing research, and so my wife would tell you that I'm a bit crazy doing that. But in terms of downtime, she's an artist, and I'm interested in the arts and culture, so we have a lot of things in common, and that's our in the downtime. But and I'm a passionate soccer player. So,
Fun.
yeah.
Well, that's good if your job perfectly suits with your interests. And having worked in different countries and with various international organizations, how have the cross-cultural experience influenced your worldview or professional practices?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I'm very sensitive to narrow nationalisms and sometimes a certain narrow-mindedness that you encounter when people have not been exposed to different cultures. I think putting yourself into somebody else's position, that ability is only enhanced if you look at how different people think, work, how different societies function.
In your journey throughout the world, is there any particular culture that you feel is the most underrated or underestimated by other people?
Oh, that's almost impossible to answer. I think I think African cultures, yes, I think African cultures, because the interpretations we have of African cultures, and I could probably say the same for some Asian and cultures as well, is very much through the eyes of the West, and therefore they're very often not seen at the same level. We talked about that in class on Tuesday, right? And I think it'd be very, very good if African scholars, let's stay with Africa, right, had more of an opportunity to bring their interpretations of their cultures to the world.
Well, I have a question regarding that. In your choice of journal for Global Perspective, do you intentionally bring international scholars to your journal as well?
I give you two answers to that. One is we have what we call the Emerging Scholars Forum, and there we try to pull in people from different parts of the world. And these are usually postdocs or PhDs just about to finish at the start of their career, and we network them. So that's one answer to that. At the same time, I have to admit that it's much easier to find active members on an editorial board when they at a place like UCLA or Berkeley or Stanford, because for them it's easier, right? If you're in a provincial and totally underfunded university in Africa or some a country in Southeast Asia, it's much more difficult to engage with a journal like ours. But then, the third part of your answer is, I introduced a special collection at a journal called Global Social Science ? And so we just published about 8 or 9 papers by scholars from the Middle East, and about 8 or 9 papers written by scholars from Latin America, right? And we're now curating contributions from India, Central Asia, and Central and Eastern Europe. And the question is always the same. What is the relationship between the dominant Western/European social science enterprise to these other parts of the world?
That's very valuable work that your journal do. Now let's shift our focus to the future. How do you anticipate the nonprofit sector will evolve in response to technological advancement and changing global needs in the coming years?
Yeah, I think the nonprofit sector, let's say, has a number of big challenges. It has grown a lot, let's say in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. And with that comes a certain professionalism, which is good. but also the notion that it may be losing some of its ethos, that it becomes too commercial, becomes too business-like. Right? The other challenge is that in many countries we have more laws and regulations on the book that take away the space for civil society initiatives. It's called a shrinking space phenomenon, and we see that in quite a number of countries. So it's more difficult for non-profits to operate, particularly internationally. So I think there are challenges ahead, but if you look at the non-profit sector, let's say 30 years ago and where it is now, a lot of advancement has been made, right? And 30 years ago there were no courses at UCLA on non-profit organizations, and now we have them, right? And there were no programs at universities teaching non-profit management, and now there are over 100 programs in the United States alone. There was no research going on, and now there is research going on. And so I'm quite hopeful, but I think, as Albert Hirschman said, every change brings a change. And so we just have to see how we negotiate commercialism, political interference, and then you mentioned it in your question, technological changes. And there I don't have a good answer on the technology side, because it will affect everything, and not only non-profits.
How do you see the role of universities evolving? And in such an unstable time in the world, do they have more roles than before? And what should institutions of higher education prioritize to remain effective?
Yeah, see, times have always been unstable. We just always, looking back, we think these were easier times, but they were not. They just had different issues. I clearly think that universities should stay out of politics. That's not their calling. That's why we have political parties and other institutions. Universities are about knowledge generation and knowledge transmission. So they should focus on teaching, and they should focus on research. But there is a lot of pressure on universities to open up to the business community. If you look at Stanford, right, all the startups coming out of Stanford, and it is turning Stanford almost into a startup university, and it changes the nature of the university. I think universities need to be a bit shielded from the outside world, and if you think that universities are the engine of technological advancement and economic growth, you overwhelm them. Right? I think we should scale down the expectations that we have looking at universities. They're also very difficult to change. Universities are very inert institutions, and perhaps for good reasons.
You mentioned universities should not interfere or be heavily involved with politics. What do you think of the recent academic censorship around many universities around the world because of bipartisan polarization, potentially?
Well, I think it's a cause of great concern. So politics should keep out of universities, and universities should keep out of politics, and that there has to be not a red line, but there has to be a mutual respect of non-interference. Right? And there are countries where that has been undermined to a considerable degree, right? And it's not only in autocratic countries, as I'm sure you know, it is also happening in other parts of the world.
Would you think university does not fall into the private sector and the public sector, but rather fall into the third sector?
Well, it is in all three. So we have public universities, right? Think about Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and we have public universities. Think about ours, right? And then we have for-profit universities, but they are not that serious a competitor to the university as such, because they don't do much research, but they're really adult education institutions called universities.
Right? And What do you see as the future of democracy, as it is a topic that is heavily emphasized in many of your works in the context of increasing global challenges such as the intensified regional conflicts, climate change, and political polarization? How should democratic institutions adapt to remain sustainable and effective?
Yeah, that is a very, very complex question. I think historically, democracy has always been challenged. There wasn't a time where we could say, oh, we solved it once and for all, except for a brief moment in the 1990s, perhaps. And you may recall Fukuyama's book on the end of history, which few people have read, and that's why he keeps being misrepresented. He actually questioned the whole process of the end of history, right? So democracy has always been challenged, and democracy today is different from the democracy we had in this country 100 years ago. So it is challenged, it is changing, and it has to be adapting. Right? Keep in mind, the United States did not become a full democracy till the 1960s. Right? Even if we think of ourselves as the land of the free, that did only apply to some citizens. Right? So you could argue that we have been a bit too lenient in recent decades, assuming that we are going through a second wave of democratization after 1990, and we did not anticipate that there could be something like a democratic recession, as a colleague of ours at Stanford, Larry Diamond, used to call it. So I think we have to get our act together, and each country or group of countries like the EU have to consider what that means. So we certainly have to invest more in democratic resilience, right? But it is ultimately, yes, it is the institutions, they have to be strengthened, but it's the people wanting to have resilient institutions that's equally important.
That's very insightful. For our final question, and considering the wide range of global challenges and opportunities we've discussed, would you describe yourself as more of an optimistic or pessimistic about the future of humanity?
That is a good final question. You know, some of my friends have accused me of being sometimes like Pangloss, right? In Voltaire's novel Camille. And Pangloss is this overly optimistic character in that novel. And he always thinks that we live in the best of all worlds. And I wouldn't go that far, but I'm certainly more on the optimistic side. If I were a pessimist, I wouldn't be sitting here. And I wouldn't do the research that I'm doing or the teaching that I'm doing. Right? So there's so much that speaks in favor of the world getting better in the next generation or two, and we only must want it. Right?
Do you want to leave a sentence, a message for UCLA students as an ending note?
I think UCLA students are in an excellent position to contribute to what we just talked about. Right? They get a good education. They have so many opportunities once they graduate, and they can make the best of it.
Thank you so much.